The HOA's yellow envelope fluttered in the summer wind, taped right to Frank Maddox's ranch gate like a public warning sign. The breeze lifted the corner of the paper, slapping it gently against the rusted metal post. Frank pulled his truck to a slow stop, engine ticking as it cooled in the heat. He sat for a moment behind the wheel, watching the envelope twitch like it was trying to escape. A bead of sweat rolled down from his temple, traced the edge of his jawline, and disappeared into the collar of his worn chambray shirt. He stepped out, boots stirring up dry dust. The gravel crunched underfoot as he walked to the gate. The envelope was stuck with thick clear tape, 2 layers, and labeled with the HOA's letterhead in bold serif font. Lakeside Estates Property Violation Notice. He peeled it off carefully, reading it in the same rhythm he used for morning devotionals, slow, deliberate, not missing a word. His grass had apparently exceeded the allowed maximum height of 3 inches. The fine, $2,000. He blinked at the figure. A flag too high had cost him $200. A non-conforming truck, another $400. But this? Grass? He folded the letter once, precisely, and tucked it into his back pocket. The road to the diner was quiet as usual, save for the whine of cicadas and the occasional pickup passing the other way. Frank pulled into the gravel lot of Eagle's Nest, where the screen door slapped shut behind a young man with a "Support Local Farmers" hat. Inside, ceiling fans spun lazily above sun-bleached booths. The smell of bacon, old wood, and burnt coffee grounds settled into his senses like a memory. Darla was already pouring coffee when he sat down. "Morning, Frank. Bacon and eggs?" He gave her a nod, and she dropped a napkin beside his mug without being asked. "Heat's gonna be a beast today," she added. "Saw a rattler curled up near the propane tank this morning." Frank offered a low grunt. "It's June. They're thirsty, same as everyone else." Roger Wynne slid into the booth across from him, his shirt tucked too neatly for a retiree. He nodded once and poured sugar into his tea like he was measuring chemicals. "You get one too?" Roger asked quietly. Frank didn't answer. He unfolded the citation and placed it flat on the table between them. Roger didn't flinch. He just leaned forward, adjusted his glasses, and read. "They're ramping up. Word is, your name came up at the last HOA meeting." Cynthia wasn't subtle. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Something about unsightly properties lowering the profile of the ridge," Roger added, voice dry. "You, a flagpole, and that old tractor of yours." Frank sipped his coffee. "Tractor runs fine. Flag's older than half those houses." Darla returned with a plate piled high and a refill already pouring. "Eat up, darlin'. Breakfast won't fix bureaucracy, but it helps the attitude." He gave her a rare half-smile and dug in. Later that afternoon, back at the ranch, Frank laid out all his HOA citations on the kitchen counter. 7 in total. Most were printed on identical cream stock. One was hand-delivered, folded too sharply at the corners. He remembered that one, he'd found it under the dog bowl after the wind caught it. He opened the worn metal file cabinet beside the wood stove. The drawer stuck, as usual. After a hard tug, he pulled out a thick folder marked Maddox, Title and Deed. It contained survey maps, utility easements, and a copy of the original subdivision boundary agreement. Frank smoothed the map out on the kitchen table. Elkhorn Ridge snaked around the old Maddox property, but the deed lines were clear. He traced the border with a calloused finger. Only 8 acres, the front wedge closest to the main road, had been annexed into Lakeside Estates when the subdivision was formed. The remaining 30 sat just beyond HOA reach. He reached for a pen and drew a clean line along the original easement. 8 acres, he muttered aloud, and they want to fine me for grass on all 38? His eyes narrowed. The next morning, with the sun still low and golden behind the hills, Frank walked to the gate again. He pulled the latest newsletter from the small metal box nailed to the post. The ink was still slightly damp from the humidity. He unfolded it, scanning headlines, HOA reminders, and a recipe for peach cobbler. Near the bottom, in smaller font, zoning reform considered for West Ridge expansion. He refolded the newsletter carefully and slid it into his back pocket, next to the citation. Then he stood a moment longer, watching the wind ripple across the dry grass like a tide of gold. A blue jay chattered somewhere up in the oaks. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about grass anymore. At the monthly HOA meeting, Cynthia called Frank's ranch aesthetic dissonance. Frank called it his wife's legacy. The room stilled after the exchange, save for the lazy creak of ceiling fans overhead and the occasional flap of a paper program in someone's hand. Folding chairs had been dragged into semi-straight rows in the Elkhorn Ridge Community Hall, the smell of lemon cleaner fighting to compete with the scent of actual lemon cookies. Cynthia Aldridge stood at the front, flanked by a painted spring landscape of the neighborhood behind her, a scene with no power lines, no rusted mailboxes, and certainly no pickup trucks with grass in the wheel wells. Frank sat near the back, alone but not unnoticed. He was dressed plainly, as usual, clean shirt, jeans pressed at the crease, and boots that hadn't been polished but had earned their scuff marks honestly. His broad shoulders leaned slightly back in the chair, arms crossed. He had listened quietly until Cynthia said the words. "I don't recall signing a contract requiring charm," he added flatly. Several heads turned. A few of the older residents shifted uncomfortably, while one or two younger ones smirked behind their styrofoam cups. Cynthia recovered with the smile she always wore in public, a practiced, pastel expression. "Of course, Mr. Maddox, we value all residents of Elkhorn Ridge. But as you're aware, the HOA's goal is to preserve a harmonious environment for the good of the community." Frank raised an eyebrow. "So my wife's tree doesn't fit into harmony now?" There was a short pause, and all eyes went to the window. Outside, the old oak tree in question stood tall and wide, its limbs sheltering the corner of Frank's front pasture and the worn flagpole beneath it. The very tree he and Mary had planted decades ago. He didn't mention the ashes in its roots. He didn't need to. Cynthia cleared her throat and shuffled a stack of papers. "The issue at hand is the number of violations accumulating on your property. The HOA exists to help homeowners adhere to standards." Frank reached into a folder on his lap and held up 3 notices. "This one says my truck is visible from the road. This one says the shed paint doesn't match community tones. This one says the barn door leans." He held them a second longer before lowering them. "My barn door leans because the foundation settled in the drought 5 years ago. It's stable. It's been inspected." From the side row, Stephen Aldridge sat still, avoiding eye contact with anyone, particularly his sister. His shirt collar wilted a little in the heat, and he dabbed at his forehead with a folded napkin. When Frank returned the papers to his folder, Stephen slipped a folded scrap across the aisle and into Frank's open file. The movement was so smooth it could have been mistaken for a tissue passed in sympathy. Frank didn't react, at least not outwardly. "The board will review your appeal, Mr. Maddox," Cynthia continued, her voice gaining volume as if trying to outrun the undercurrent in the room. "But please understand, we apply our standards uniformly." Frank didn't argue. He simply sat back, his hands resting on the folder, eyes on Cynthia but expression unreadable. After the meeting adjourned, residents filtered toward the lemonade station, clinking ice in their cups and nibbling on cookies that tasted more like flour than citrus. Frank rose slowly, and as he reached the doorway, a familiar face stepped through it. She had dark shoulder-length hair pulled back loosely and wore a blazer that looked like it hadn't been unpacked long from a moving box. Her eyes scanned the room quickly before landing on him. "Frank Maddox?" she asked. He nodded once. "I'm Kate Raines. You knew my mother, Joan." Frank blinked, then took a half step closer. "Joan Kavanaugh. She married later, Raines, but yes. I'm her daughter." He nodded again, slower this time. "We went to school together. Your mother was a fine woman. She always said you and my mom were." Kate caught herself and smiled. "She used to call you and Mary that solid pair. Said y'all made the town feel stable." Frank didn't smile, but he did soften. Kate held up a manila envelope. "I found this when sorting her things. It had your name on it. He took it with both hands, carefully. Inside was a single sheet of stationery, folded twice. The handwriting was unmistakably Joan's. Neat, slanted, with a loop in the G that Mary used to mimic just to tease her. Kate watched his eyes track the words. "If you're ever back in Elkhorn, find Frank," she quoted gently. "He'll tell you what honor looks like." Frank closed the letter slowly, almost reverently, and looked up at Kate. "I think she knew more than she let on," he said, voice low. Kate nodded. "So do I." Frank's response to a $2,000 fine, a $20,000 tactical range, and a smoker pit that could make a Baptist preacher curse. The ground cracked underfoot as Frank stepped into the back acreage of Maddox Hollow, dry mesquite pods crunching softly with each bootfall. The sun was barely over the ridge, but the Texas heat had already settled in like it had paid rent. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the barrel smoker he'd rolled out earlier that morning, the scent of hickory mingling with mesquite and slow-cooked brisket. The smoker wasn't the centerpiece, though. Not today. Today was about tape measures, rebar stakes, and boundary lines, lines he now knew the HOA couldn't touch. Kate Raines stood beside him in a pair of worn work boots and aviator sunglasses, holding a clipboard and tapping the map with a capped pen. "Confirmed. This fence line here, everything past it falls outside the HOA's jurisdiction. These 8 acres in front are fair game for citations. The other 30? She looked up, eyes shaded. "All yours." Frank grunted in approval, then crouched slowly beside a flagged stake and began to anchor it deeper into the soil. His hands shook slightly with effort, a tremor he'd grown used to in recent years. But when he reached into the folder to sign the project approval form for submission to the county, his signature came out smooth, level, precise. "You don't do things halfway, do you?" Kate asked, watching him. "Not when they push," he said simply. The tactical facility wasn't large by military standards, but it didn't need to be. It needed to be just visible enough from Cynthia's back patio to sour her orange juice. 3 shooting lanes, angled away from the HOA border. Berms reinforced with stacked railroad ties. A shaded instruction canopy. All of it carefully laid out according to the safety manual Ryan had emailed. By mid-afternoon, the sun had scorched even the flies into submission. The buzz of a diesel engine broke the quiet as a black flatbed rumbled down the main driveway and came to a heavy stop near the barn. Ryan Garber stepped out, sleeves rolled up, ball cap backward, and a sandwich bag already half empty. "You sure this ain't just a midlife crisis?" Ryan called out with a grin. Frank shook his head. "Too old for that. This is principle." Ryan whistled low as he surveyed the layout. "You did your homework. This'll pass inspection easy. Hell, cleaner than some of the state-certified sites I've seen." They got to work unloading materials, rubber matting, target frames, steel plates. Ryan handed over a wrapped sandwich somewhere between the 3rd and 4th trip. "I heard about that HOA lady," he said between bites. "You got them that riled up, you must be doing something right." Frank didn't answer directly. Instead, he pointed toward the far oak line. "That tree line's a good sound buffer. Might build a small education shelter there, run youth safety courses, veterans retraining. All legal. All on file." Ryan raised his drink in salute. "I'll help you set up the classroom. I got extra whiteboards from the last NRA certification class." By the time the sun began to drop low enough to cast shadows across the freshly marked gravel, Roger Wynne had stopped by with a ladder and a tool belt. Together, he and Frank mounted motion sensor lights on the old post that once held a birdhouse. "Wild hogs'll trigger it," Roger said. "Or anyone snooping with bad intentions." Frank nodded. "That's the idea." Before leaving, Roger pulled a folded flyer from his shirt pocket and tucked it under a magnet on Frank's fridge. "Veterans Barbecue next weekend," he said. "Red Ridge Park. You ought to come." Frank didn't commit, but his glance lingered on the words, "open to all service members and friends." By evening, the sound of drills and gravel had faded into the rhythmic crackle of the smoker. Frank stepped back from the makeshift firing lane and looked toward the far tree line, where heat shimmered off the air in waves. The HOA mansions peeked through from beyond, uniform in their pastel perfection. And then, right on cue, a silver sedan rolled slowly to the property's edge. It stopped abruptly, kicking up dust. Cynthia Aldridge emerged in low heels and pressed slacks, fanning herself with a glossy brochure. Her eyes narrowed at the sight of targets already mounted and ready. She took 3 measured steps forward. "You can't, this is residential. This is not, it's not appropriate." Frank wiped his palms on his jeans and walked toward the fence that marked the property boundary. "Everything here's by the book," he said, calm as always. "I'll need to review your permits," she said, voice tight. Frank tipped his hat slowly. "You'll hear it before you see it, and it's all by the book." The first training shot echoed through the oak grove, and knocked Cynthia's brunch napkins right off the table. The harpist paused mid-glissando, one manicured hand hovering in the air like a bird unsure where to land. A faint metallic ring followed, then silence, thick, stretching, uncertain. The patio guests froze in place, hands mid-reach for cucumber sandwiches, polite laughter caught mid-breath. Cynthia Aldridge blinked twice, expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and disdain, as she reached to pin the white linen napkin back beneath her glass of elderflower spritzer. "Was that gunfire?" asked Mrs. Connolly from 3 doors down, her voice the only one brave enough to rise. "It most certainly was," Cynthia replied, pressing her lips into a line so tight it might have snapped. "He's testing his range." Roger Wynne would later joke that the only thing injured that morning was Cynthia's centerpiece, a bowl of mint floating in lemon slices that had jostled just enough to spill a few droplets across the lace tablecloth. But in that moment, as HOA board members looked at one another with a mix of outrage and awkward fascination, Cynthia saw something far more dangerous: control slipping. Across the fence line, Frank Maddox stood in the filtered morning light beneath the oaks, arms folded as he watched 3 veterans kneel beside shooting benches. The men wore ear protection and safety vests, their movements slow and practiced. One reloaded while another took careful aim at a steel target shaped like a silhouette, positioned safely against the berm. No shouting. No showmanship. Just the mechanical rhythm of training: aim, fire, assess. Kate had helped Frank prepare a small informational handout for neighbors, printed in neutral tones, offering operating hours and safety certifications. Roger had stapled 2 copies onto community bulletin boards, even laminated them against the summer rain. A few copies made their way into mailboxes. What Frank hadn't expected was the foot traffic. By mid-morning, people walking their dogs had begun to pause along the back trail just west of the property line. Some looked disapproving, others curious. A teenager with braces and his father, both in matching Army-Strong shirts, nodded respectfully as Frank explained the safe zones. A woman in a wide sun hat leaned in to ask about quiet hours and whether the range offered civilian safety classes. He gave polite answers, but didn't press the conversation. That afternoon, a courier delivered a formal notice from the HOA, community complaint, excessive noise and disturbance of peace. Frank read it on the porch with his boots propped against the cooler and a glass of iced tea sweating beside him. Roger sat nearby, flipping through a notepad filled with field measurements and printouts. "They didn't mention the time of the noise," Roger observed. "Didn't ask for mitigation either," Frank replied. "Just demanded review. Standard bluster." Frank sipped his tea. "We'll answer it by the book." The emergency HOA meeting was held 2 evenings later, unofficially, at Cynthia's home. The setting was less formal than the community hall but somehow more severe. The chairs were stiffer, the lighting warmer, and the judgment thicker in the air. Cynthia stood beside a projected slideshow, clicking through blurry photos of Frank's range. "These structures are incompatible with the tone of Elkhorn Ridge," she declared. "And the noise, children are frightened. Homeowners are calling me with tears in their voices." Frank remained silent until she opened the floor. He stood slowly, wearing his boots and a pressed collared shirt, hair still damp from a quick rinse. He carried no folder, only a single laminated packet. "My name's Frank Maddox. I own Lot B, 12 and A and 9. Combined, they're 38 acres, only 8 of which fall under HOA regulation. The rest is grandfathered land under pre-1980 zoning. Here's a copy of the property survey, with highlights. Here's my county permit. Here's the safety review signed by Sheriff Denton's office. I'm operating within legal boundaries. He passed the documents to Cynthia without comment. She looked at them but didn't take them from his hand. Stephen, seated beside her, reached out instead and nodded. The HOA has the right to enforce. Only on HOA property, Frank said evenly. I'm here as a courtesy. One woman in the back raised her hand timidly. Do you have set hours? My grandson's interested. He's in ROTC. Cynthia's face shifted. Sunday through Friday, Frank answered. 10 to 4. No rapid fire. No weekends unless requested. Another man asked, what caliber were those shots? They didn't sound bad. Frank hesitated, then answered plainly. .22s for now. We're starting with light loads. Safety before sound. The meeting didn't end in applause or chaos. It ended in uncertainty. A seed of doubt had been planted in the perfectly trimmed hedges of HOA authority. As Frank stepped back out into the warm evening air, his phone buzzed. A message from Kate. Just found something in the zoning archive. ZR 211 might be the key. ZR 211 wasn't just missing, it had never been officially recorded. That made it dangerous. Kate Raines sat behind her desk, one leg tucked beneath her, her blazer draped over the back of the chair like she'd peeled it off mid-thought. The ceiling fan ticked faintly overhead, its pull chain knocking the glass globe with each rotation. Outside the open window, the faint hum of a lawnmower drifted in from down the block, mixing with the chirr of cicadas and the creak of her office's front screen door, which had been out of alignment since the early 2000s. She pushed a stack of photocopied meeting minutes to the side and refocused on the thin manila envelope Stephen Aldridge had delivered an hour earlier. No cover letter. No greeting. Just a single line scrawled across the flap in tidy, engineer-like penmanship, not in public minutes. Frank sat opposite her, arms crossed loosely over his chest, watching her process. She held a mug of lemon tea in one hand, her fingers trembling slightly every time she glanced at the HOA letterhead within the pile. I keep thinking we've seen the worst, she said, setting the mug down gently. And then someone opens another drawer. Frank didn't speak right away. He waited while she laid out the papers in a careful sequence, one copy of the last published HOA meeting minutes, one internal memo marked draft, and, most damningly, a proposed resolution labeled ZR 211 with signatures that looked suspiciously too clean. Kate tapped the signatures. 3 of these names. One died in 2019. Another moved to Colorado last year. The third, Mr. Duncan, is legally blind and couldn't have signed this even if he wanted to. I called his niece. Frank leaned forward. So they faked it. Kate nodded. That's putting it gently. She stood, crossed the room to the tall shelf, and pulled down a dusty binder labeled County Zoning Overlays, Elkhorn Ridge. The pages inside were brittle around the edges, some pages yellowed from decades of use. She flipped through with practiced fingers. This is the original 1994 boundary map, she said. This, she pulled out a thin plastic sleeve containing a newer draft, was never officially logged but was circulated during HOA workshops 2 years ago. It shows an expansion into what they're now calling sensitive water buffer zones. She slid a third sheet in front of Frank. See this parcel here? Your back acres sit right on top of it. And that shading? She pointed. That's a groundwater marker. Frank's brow furrowed. Aquifer? Kate nodded again. Not just any aquifer. A clean one. Deep, low salinity, and rare for this part of the county. I had a geologist friend look it over. They ran tests when Lakeside Estates was first built, classified it, then filed it away. Frank leaned back. So that's why the noise suddenly started. They don't want your grass. They want your water. There was a knock at the front door, gentle but insistent. Kate glanced toward the window but didn't move. Frank rose instead and opened it. Stephen Aldridge stood there, dressed more casually than usual, no tie, sleeves rolled up, eyes tired. "I won't stay long," he said. Inside, he placed a stack of printouts on the desk with careful hands. "Those are early drafts. ZR 211 went through 3 iterations. Cynthia told us the signatures were in process, just a formality," she said. Kate didn't hide her skepticism. "Why bring this to us now?" Stephen shifted, glancing at Frank, then back to the papers. "Because she's gone too far. And because I didn't sign that draft, even though my name's on it." Frank watched him carefully. "You willing to testify?" Stephen hesitated only a moment. "If it comes to it, yes. I will." He left shortly after, not waiting for gratitude or promises. Just a nod, and then the soft click of the door behind him. Kate took a breath. "He's scared." "Good," Frank said. "Means he knows it's real." As the sun dipped lower, Kate sifted through the remaining folders on her desk. One caught her eye, a beige file labeled, "Well Usage, 2003. Inside, an old report outlined exploratory drilling on the Maddox land perimeter. It had been flagged as non-priority at the time due to lack of funding. She shook her head. "They've been eyeing this land for 20 years. Frank remained quiet, eyes narrowing at the document. His hand rested lightly on the edge of her desk, knuckles pale. The phone rang just before closing, an unfamiliar number. Kate answered, and her posture straightened. Yes, he's here with me." She cupped the receiver. "Frank, it's for you." He took the phone and listened in silence. After a moment, his eyes darkened. "Thank you," he said, then hung up. "Who was it?" "A nurse from hospice. Remember Gerald Watkins? Former HOA treasurer. He just sent me something. It's arriving by mail." Kate tilted her head. "What kind of something?" Frank's voice was steady. "A folder. Sealed. Labeled confidential, Aldridge Initiative." Frank didn't see flames, but the smell of fuel by his equipment shed was warning enough. The twilight was unusually still, the wind having dropped to a low, warm hum. Crickets hadn't started up yet, and the cicadas had already settled. It was the hour when the land took a breath, the in-between. Frank stood just past the barn gate, hand resting on the latch, eyes narrowed toward the rear slope where the storage shed cast long, uneven shadows. He hadn't planned to walk the perimeter tonight, but the dogs had barked oddly, once, a short, alarmed burst, and gone quiet. That alone would have drawn him out. What stopped him cold now wasn't sound, but scent. Gasoline, acrid and wrong, clung to the ground near the rear wall of the shed. A darkened patch of soil, maybe a quart's worth, gleamed faintly under the rising moonlight. Frank stepped back, slow and steady, scanning for prints. Nothing deep. But someone had been here. And not to prune hedges. He didn't call Kate. Not yet. He called Sheriff Miles Denton. The man showed up 20 minutes later in his county-issued truck, boots dusty from a different ranch visit up north. He kept his Stetson on, even in the dusk. "Show me," was all he said. Frank led him around the side, flashlight beam catching the glint of something metallic near the wheelbarrow. Denton crouched, sniffed once, then stood again. "Accelerant," he said, non-committal. "But no ignition. No matches, no residue." "Not sloppy," Frank replied. "Measured." Denton rubbed his jaw, eyes scanning the tree lean. "Could be pranksters. Could be something else. You think teenagers are walking 4 acres in the dark with 5 gallons of gas?" Denton didn't answer. Instead, he walked the line around the shed, checked for boot prints. "No tracks clear enough. You got cameras out back?" Frank nodded. "2. wired into Roger's motion system. Then check M. Roger met Frank the next morning just after sunrise, still in his flannel pajama shirt and jeans tucked hastily into work boots. They huddled over the small monitor in Frank's office, fast-forwarding through hours of stillness. Around 2:38 a.m., a spike. The motion light clicked on, but the footage blurred, static and ghosting across the screen. Roger frowned and tapped keys, opening a hidden backup drive. There, he muttered. The alternate stream loaded, slower but cleaner. A figure appeared, stepping into frame near the rear corner of the shed. Slender build, uniform stance. A ball cap and jacket. One hand carried a container. The other reached toward the fence but never crossed it. Roger rewound, paused. Looks like Vince, he said quietly. One of the HOA contractors. Drives the green Dodge. Does tree trimming. Frank stared at the screen. The man had stood there for 12 seconds before stepping back into shadow. Denton reviewed the footage mid-morning at the station. He didn't say much. He never did. You're not filing yet? Frank asked after the playback ended. Denton leaned back in his chair. It's suspicious. But I can't file a charge on a man standing near your shed holding a can, not if he didn't light anything or cross a property line. So they just get to walk around with gas in the dark? Denton's eyes flicked to him. I didn't say that. I'm saying be careful. Keep recording. And keep that range legal. Frank nodded once and left the office. He drove past town on the way home, watching as the morning's copy of the Elkhorn Gazette hit the newsstands. The HOA newsletter had been slipped into it, an insert, printed in pastel hues with serif font and smiles. He pulled one out at the diner and read it while Darla poured his coffee. Multiple residents have expressed concern, he read aloud, regarding unregulated combustible storage and excessive property clutter on Beach 12. The board reminds all residents that fire safety remains our top priority. We urge vigilance and community feedback to prevent trauma and hazard. Darla raised an eyebrow. They trying to say you're the danger now? Frank folded the paper neatly. Looks that way. Half the booths were filled. A few nodded at him. Others looked away too quickly. Conversations were quieter than usual. Small-town gears, already shifting. That night, Frank sat on the porch with a notepad in his lap. The cicadas were back, singing as if nothing had changed. He stared past the fence line into the darkening oaks and scribbled a line before closing the book. Some people weaponize rules. Others defend with them. Inside, his phone buzzed with a message from Kate. Drafting cease and desist now. Formal injunction in process. We fight on all fronts. Cynthia arrived with a color-coded binder, Frank arrived with a USB drive and a quiet resolve. The folding chairs squeaked beneath shifting weight as residents of Elkhorn Ridge filed into the high school auditorium, murmurs rising and falling like tides along the gymnasium walls. The room held the scent of paper programs, old wood polish, and peach cobbler. The church ladies had set up their bake table just inside the double doors, proceeds marked Veterans Fund. Overhead, the fans pushed lukewarm air in slow spirals. At the front of the stage, a projector hummed quietly. Cynthia stood beside it in a cream blazer and matching heels, binder already open to a tab marked Community Integrity. Her smile was calm, gracious, seasoned. It was the same smile she had worn for years, ribbon cuttings, bake sales, HOA luncheons. Tonight, though, it didn't quite reach her eyes. Frank Maddox walked in alone. He wore the same pressed shirt and boots he'd worn to the range inspection 2 weeks earlier, but tonight, there was a weight to his steps. He nodded to no one in particular and found a seat near the front row, USB drive in hand. His only adornment was a small American flag pin on his collar, dulled at the edges. Sheriff Denton sat along the wall in uniform, arms folded, eyes steady. Cynthia stepped forward as the audience settled. Thank you all for being here, she began. Elkhorn Ridge is more than a development, it's a vision. A safe, clean, unified vision. But lately, that vision has been challenged by behaviors that are, frankly, out of step with what this community values. There were nods, mostly from the back rows. A few murmurs. Cynthia continued, her voice growing firmer. We've had concerns. Noise, property compliance, safety. Children frightened. Property values jeopardized. My responsibility is to protect what we've all built. She gestured to the backdrop behind her, a blown-up rendering of Elkhorn Ridge in watercolor. Smooth lawns, identical shutters. Not a flagpole or shooting lane in sight. Kate Raines stepped up next, carrying a slim laptop and a legal pad. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I'd like to walk you through a timeline, she said. ZR 211. A zoning measure that was never officially recorded with the county but was used to expand HOA influence over properties not covered by the original charter. She clicked through slides, meeting minutes, signature inconsistencies, notarization discrepancies. 3 of the signers were either deceased, relocated, or never contacted. That's forgery. And here, she paused on a scanned financial ledger, we see HOA discretionary funds used for a series of unapproved landscaping contracts, all awarded to a company owned by Ms. Aldridge's cousin. The room rustled. Whispers spread like brushfire. Kate closed the laptop and looked out over the crowd. These are not opinions. These are records. Frank stood next. No microphone. No notes. I've lived on that land since 1981, he said. Planted every tree with my wife. Paid every bill. Followed every law. But some people, they don't follow the same rules they enforce. He held up the USB. Last week, someone tried to start a fire near my shed. Didn't light it, but left the fuel. We checked the cameras. This is what we found. Roger, seated in the second row, leaned forward and clicked play. The projector lit up with grainy black and white footage. A man stepped into frame with a gas can, glanced around, and started to pour near the foundation of the shed. A voice, clear, recorded from a separate mic, came next. Leave it messy enough to catch fire, he'll get blamed. The voice was unmistakable. Cynthia froze. Gasps filled the auditorium. Someone stood up in the back, pointing. That's you. Cynthia fumbled with the clicker in her hand, her smile gone, her color fading. That's taken out of context. That was part of a woman near the aisle interrupted, voice sharp. You threatened my grandson last year over a lawn gnome. Another, you said my porch swing was a blight. A third, you shut down our community garden because the fence wasn't the right shade of beige. Voices layered, louder, angrier. Sheriff Denton stood slowly. His voice carried. This meeting is now part of a formal review. County's been notified. We'll be opening a full investigation into HOA practices under Miss Aldridge's leadership. The room hushed. Cynthia looked at the sheriff, at Frank, then at her brother, seated silently in the second row. Stephen stood, adjusting his glasses. I didn't sign ZR 211. And neither did most of the names on that list. That broke something in her. She turned toward the crowd, eyes wide, shoulders stiff. This town, she hissed, has no idea who it's turning against. Then she spun on her heel and stormed toward the doors, binder clutched to her chest like a life vest made of paper. The gunshots were measured, deliberate, and legal, but the real sound echoing across Maddox Hollow was something deeper, peace reclaimed. The sun had barely crested the hill when the first trucks pulled in, tires crunching against gravel and late summer grass. By mid-morning, the old fence posts lining Frank Maddox's property were adorned with bunting and American flags, flapping gently in a forgiving breeze. Folding chairs ringed shaded picnic tables. Smoke from the barbecue pit curled upward in clean spirals, carrying the smell of pulled pork and mesquite through the field like an invitation. Frank stood at the entrance in his Sunday boots and cleanest shirt, greeting guests with quiet nods and the occasional handshake. A small clipboard hung from his belt, but he hadn't looked at it all morning. The work was done. Kate Raines stood near a banner that read Maddox Tactical Reserve, grand opening, and gave a short interview to a local journalist with a crooked press badge and a well-thumbed notepad. "We've implemented full zoning reform proposals at the county level," she explained. "Transparent boundaries, audited approvals, homeowner protections. No more loopholes for bad actors." She smiled once, small, but real, and then excused herself to refill her lemonade. Stephen Aldridge hovered near the pulled pork station, helping a teenage volunteer adjust the donation jar labeled Veteran Legal Aid Fund. He'd left his tie at home, rolled his sleeves, and answered every question that came his way with the gentle clarity of someone determined to do better. "I never saw it for what it was," he admitted quietly to Frank as they stood shoulder to shoulder watching a safety demonstration at the range. "I thought it was order. Turns out, it was just control." Frank didn't reply right away. He just clapped a hand on Stephen's shoulder and offered a rare, quiet thanks. Roger Wynn manned the microphone for most of the day, calling out raffle numbers and introducing veterans who shared brief stories between demos. Sheriff Denton stood off to the side with a paper plate in hand, eating brisket with one hand and shaking hands with the other. The air buzzed with warmth, not just from the weather, but from something communal. Neighbors who'd once whispered behind closed doors now shared cobbler recipes. Children ran under the shade of the old oak tree that had stood long before the HOA had drawn its first boundary line. Even a few former critics had shown up, drawn by curiosity or something more honest. Cynthia Aldridge's name wasn't mentioned, but her absence lingered in the background like a wind finally stilled. Her trial was scheduled for October, charges ranging from forgery to fraud. Rumors said she'd moved out of the Ridge entirely. Frank hadn't asked. By late afternoon, the crowd began to thin, but the mood remained high. Someone began folding chairs, someone else stacked cups near the cooler. A group of veterans carried leftover supplies toward the barn. Frank stepped onto the makeshift platform and tapped the mic once, drawing a hush over the clearing. "Freedom isn't always loud," he said. "But it always lasts longer than fear." A ripple of clapping began at the front and moved back like wind through wheat. Frank gave a small nod, stepped down, and returned to the table where his old journal sat beneath a napkin-weighted clipboard. As the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long, a teenage boy approached, thin, nervous, his sneakers too clean for the dust of the field. "Mr. Maddox," he asked. "Do you take volunteers?" Frank looked him over, caught the sincerity behind the shyness, and stood. He handed the boy a broom and nodded toward the pavilion. "We all start somewhere." Later, when the last sandwich had been wrapped, the last chair folded, and the last dog wandered off leash back toward the fence, Frank sat alone on his porch. The cicadas had resumed their summer song. The lights in the barn were off. The range sat quiet and dignified, like it had always belonged. He opened his logbook and wrote one final line before setting down his pen. "Legacy intact." As the sun dipped behind the oak line and laughter drifted across the open field, it was clear Elkhorn Ridge had reclaimed more than just quiet, it had reclaimed its soul. What began as one man standing firm became a community remembering its roots, and choosing fairness over fear. When rules are used with wisdom, they protect; when twisted, they divide, but truth, like water beneath the land, always finds a way through. Perhaps it's never too late to stand beside our neighbors, to draw a firm line when kindness is mistaken for weakness. And maybe, just maybe, the sound of freedom isn't thunder, it's the calm that follows when justice is finally heard.